As the influencer civil war over the future of MAGA continues, Ben Shapiro appeared on Triggernometry this week, but it wasn't his comments about Zohran Mamdani, Nick Fuentes, or Tucker Carlson which became the defining clip of the interview. Instead, it was his suggestion that if young Americans can't afford to live in the towns and cities they were born and raised in, like New York, then they should just move to wherever is cheaper.
If you're a young person and you can't afford to live here, then maybe you should not live here. I mean, that is a real thing. Yeah, I know that we've now grown up in a society that says that you deserve to live where you grew up, but the reality is that the history of America is almost literally the opposite of that. The history of America is you go to a place where there is opportunity. And if the opportunities are limited here and they're not changing, then you really should try to think about other places where you have better opportunities.
That is the least appealing sales pitch to Generation Z that I could conceive of, and it's why Romney-style unfettered capitalism republicanism is dying and being replaced within the MAGA coalition by protectionism, repatriating manufacturing, and overtures to the labor movement made by Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. And this has always been a split within the Republican Party. Eric Kaufman, in his book on immigration and identity in 2018, White Shift, spoke about the 2 centuries history of faction wars between libertarian and liberal Republicans who wanted to open borders to import cheap labor versus the labor movements who are more interested in putting American workers, and thereby a distinct American people, first. On pages 40 and 41, he writes, "Commercial interests drew on the asylum tradition in their call for more open immigration. In the 1850s, the elite developmentalist wing of the Republican Party emerged as the chief vessel for commercial interests. In 1864, the Republican Party enacted legislation permitting imported contract labor and, quote, reaffirmed the historic role of the United States as an asylum for the oppressed of all nations, end quote, endorsing a, quote, liberal and just immigration policy which would encourage foreign immigration, end quote. After 1849, thousands of Chinese, disproportionately male, entered California during the gold rush. By 1880, they made up over 10% of the population of the Golden State. Chinese contract laborers were the first recruited in the 1860s, used by railway magnates to construct the Transcontinental Railroad because they could be paid a third less than white workers. Quote, all I want in my business is muscle, declared a large employer in California in the 1870s. Quote, I don't care whether it be obtained from a Chinaman or a white man, from a mule or a horse. Southern elites, not least Ku Klux Klan founder Nathan Bedford Forrest, called for Chinese immigration to quell black labor demands after the Civil War. Opposition to immigration was centered in the urban Protestant working class. An important part of the Republican base consisted of former know-nothings, many of whom were tradesmen. Pressure from this quarter led to repeal of the contract labor statute, but the battle would continue in California in the 1870s. Most Protestant Americans lived in the countryside and relatively few inhabited larger cities. Nevertheless, urban labor, especially mechanics and those in the craft unions, drew on the ethnic and racial traditions of American nationhood to call for restricted entry. Meanwhile, older waves of immigrants were progressively assimilated into the white working class. One index of assimilation was Irish Catholic participation in the anti-Chinese Working Men's Party in California, whose agitation resulted in the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Led by Irish-born Dennis Kearney, it brought Protestant and Catholic together in what has been described as the most successful labor-based movement in American history. Conflict between capital and labor was growing, with captains of industry squaring off against rising national labor unions, such as the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor, AFL. For most of American history, notes Brian Grattan, capitalists were the main advocates of immigration while organized labor consistently opposed it. But more than class conflict was at stake. At the elite level, the asylum tradition played an important part in legitimating immigration. John Hutchinson writes that national identities are not monolithic, but involve factions wedded to opposing interpretations of national identity. The American asylum narrative was an idiom of nationhood that could be marshaled by pro-immigration forces to keep the country's doors open. So, there has always been a pro-immigration for cheap labor versus immigration restriction for protecting cultural cohesion and the interests of American laborers faction war within the Republican Party, and Ben Shapiro represents the cheap labor faction. This is why, about 8 years ago, he said, "I don't give a damn about the browning of America." And this is why, despite people defending him for this clip, because seconds before he had suggested measures to make housing more affordable, something Konstantin Kisin said is going to drive young radicalism in his ARC 2023 speech, Ben suggested only removing rent controls and building more homes. He did not mention immigration, given that New York is about a third native New Yorker now. The majority of the state is either from out of state, so internal migration, or immigrants, international migration. And this constant population churn causes native New Yorkers and Americans more broadly to be in competition for economic opportunities with the entire world as a potential labor pool, thereby driving down the cost of labor, thereby pricing them out of affordable jobs from which they could purchase a home of their own or support a family on a single income. And people recognize that this element of the free market sales pitch is rarely addressed. People recognize that the Republican Party and its free marketeers have historically been the enablers of mass migration because, in order to maximize profits and increase GDP, you can grow the population expediently through mass migration, and shareholders can increase their profits by driving down the cost of labor. And the way you drive down the cost of labor is you increase the pool among which laborers are competing by opening up labor to the rest of the world. And there has been no more egregious example of exploiting American workers than H-1Bs, where 70% of which are Indians, because India exploits H-1B applications, they exploit the visa lottery, by running visa farms in their country. And so, a country's material prosperity relies on its cultural cohesion, which relies on its people and their culture remaining an unchallenged majority in their country. But if Americans are playing by one set of rules, meritocratic, individualistic, Anglo-Protestant work ethic, and other groups that have been imported into America, or are just Americans in waiting, according to the values-based paperwork American rendition of American identity, are playing by another set of rules, are clannish, ethnically nepotistic, and less honest, then Americans, heritage Americans, who are competing on fair terms, will be exploited by the other group who have no cultural qualms about exploiting the high trust culture that they are entering into. And they will ruin that high trust culture, and thereby they will ruin the economy because the economy relies on that high trust culture. It relies on Americans. And so if you don't admit that mass migration causes cultural change in order to expediently squeeze short-term profits, and thereby long-term sabotage the economy, people will recognize that you are giving them a false bill of goods. And this is why the protectionist labor movement, encouraging the repatriating of manufacturing and American jobs, has become a winning formula, has brought a broad tent for MAGA. This is why Ben Shapiro's vision of pull yourself up by your bootstraps capitalism is not succeeding. As Shoeonhead points out in the comments to this clip, 7 years ago Ben had this debate with Tucker Carlson on his Sunday special, where Tucker was ridiculed at the time for wanting to deny automatic trucking because it would deprive non-college educated American men with well-paying and meaningful jobs. And he pointed out that the economy clearly isn't a god to worship in and of itself, because if the economy is not allowing American college graduates who aren't drinking all day, who aren't smoking weed, who are go-getters, to own their own home and support a family on a single income, what is the point of the economy? Tucker was ridiculed at the time as a protectionist, an antediluvian, a Luddite, but actually, this is the vision that is winning out. And it's because people realize that the promise of a invisible hand that will work by natural rules to allocate everyone their allotted share of America's economic largesse according to their ability isn't working, because large corporations work with the government to import cheap foreign labor to price them out of jobs and homes in their own country. And the fact that this was not acknowledged in this clip means that people realize that the sales pitch for unfettered free markets actually just ends up dislocating people from their families, from their regional culture, from their identity, forces them to comply with market pressure, has a downward pressure on their ability to own homes and have families, and that this isn't a system that is serving anyone, and so we shouldn't support it. Turns out, If You're Being Replaced, Just Move is not an enticing sales pitch to heritage Americans who are not just rational, fungible, replaceable economic widgets, but instead are members of families, congregations, local communities, states with their own identities, and want to raise families around their extended family as a support network rather than having to outsource this to either a state-funded or low-wage daycare in which their kids are more likely to be abused or at the very least have not their parents' values, but the institution's progressive values instilled in them to make them hate their own country, history, heritage, culture, and identity. Again, not a very attractive prospect. And that is what this promise of pure market demand dictating all of your actions ends up with. This doesn't conserve anything except the growth of GDP in an economy which already has unsustainable levels of debt and which relies on importing cheap foreign labor, inconsiderate of the culture that you should be seeking to conserve as a guarantee of that economic prosperity in the first place. And this vision is why J.D. Vance, not Mitt Romney, succeeded in the Republican Party. J.D. Vance's acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention, which he trial ran at NatCon the week before in 2024, mentioned the story of how he promised to his wife Usha that she would inherit a plot of land in Kentucky where his ancestors had been buried for generations, and that it was this knowledge that he and his family would be laid to rest there one day by his own children that drives his preservation of America. That America is not just an idea, that America is a people. He says, we're done importing foreign labor, we're going to fight for American citizens and their good jobs and their good wages. We're done buying energy from countries that hate us. We're going to get it right here from American workers in Pennsylvania and Ohio across the country. We're done sacrificing supply chains to unlimited global trade, and we're going to stamp more and more products with that beautiful label, made in the USA. We're going to build factories again and put people to work making real products for American families made with the hands of American workers. That intention to protect the economy of America is rooted in the fact that Vance feels a kinship with his ancestors, with his culture, and with his land, because he says, that cemetery plot in eastern Kentucky is near my family's ancestral home, and like a lot of people, we came from the mountains of Appalachia into the factories of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Those people are very hardworking people, and they're good people. They're the kind of people who would give you the shirt off their back even if they can't afford to eat. They love this country not only because it's a good idea, but because in their bones they know that this is their home and it will be their children's home, and they would fight to die protecting it. That is the source of America's greatness. Now, in that cemetery, there are people who were born around the time of the Civil War, and if, as I hope, my wife and I are eventually laid to rest there and our kids follow us, there will be 7 generations just in that small mountain cemetery plot in eastern Kentucky. 7 generations of people who have fought for this country, who have built this country, who have made things in this country, and who would fight and die to protect this country if they were asked to. That's not just an idea, my friends. That's not just a set of principles. Even though the ideas and the principles are great, that is a homeland. That is our homeland. People will not fight for abstractions, but they will fight for their home. And if this movement of ours is going to succeed, and if this country is going to thrive, our leaders have to remember that America is a nation, and its citizens deserve leaders who put its interest first. America is a place, a people in that place, and all of the ideas and values and abstractions that have flowed from them should not be dislocated from that place and from that people whose interests should be put first. And you know what doesn't put those interests first? Encouraging people to move away from their homes and families in order to chase expedient economic opportunities, determined by their centralization in cities, which act as portals to the rest of the world to provide those people with those opportunities. America is not an opportunity zone. It's not an economic zone. It is, as Vice President Vance says, a home, and a home ceases to be a home if it is filled with strangers, especially if those strangers outnumber and push out of the home the homeowners. So, no, the homeowners shouldn't be moving from their homes. Instead, the strangers shouldn't be going there and sucking up all of the opportunities. Now, Ben's response to this speech at the time was telling, because he didn't understand why J.D. Vance was saying America is not an idea, it is a nation. A nation, in the biblical sense, means people.
America is not just an idea. It is a group of people with a shared history and a common future. It is, in short, a nation. Now, it is part of that tradition, of course, that we welcome newcomers. But when we allow newcomers into our American family, we allow them on our terms. People will not fight for abstractions, but they will fight for their home. And if this movement of ours is going to succeed, and if this country is going to thrive, our leaders have to remember that America is a nation and its citizens deserve leaders who put its interests first.
Okay, now, again, I agree with everything he's saying. I'm just not sure what he's arguing against. Because obviously America is a nation. France is also a nation. Poland is also a nation. Right? When he says that America is a land, yes, so is literally every other land. That's true. And America happens to be the best land. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. It's the best land and it's the best nation. But why? Why? And the answer is the idea that's connected to those things. So he says that America is not just an idea. And of course, that's true. I think the thing that he's arguing against, and here I agree with him, I think the thing he's arguing against is this sort of abstracted idea that Joe Biden uses all the time, where he says it's not who we are. And what he means by that is it's not who the left is. Okay, the attempt to universalize American values in the sense that they can either be exported to Iraq or imported from Guatemala. That's silly and it's wrong. And I think that's what he is saying right there. But when he says that people don't fight for ideas, obviously that's not true. That's certainly not true. I mean, I'm sorry, the Cold War was a war of ideas. It turns out it was not just a war of territories. Otherwise, it would be like most European wars, which are wars of territory. Turns out that people fight for ideas all the time. The idea is connected to the home. That's what makes America a nation. And I think that's what he's trying to say. I hope that's what he's trying to say. Because otherwise, I'm not sure what the exact what is he arguing against?
He's not arguing against Joe Biden, Ben. He's arguing against you. He's arguing against the idea that those ideas can be dislocated from a people. He's not saying that the ideas and the values are what makes America great. He is saying that the people make America, and they are what make America great. It's not just a landmass of whose borders can change. America has expanded over time when it's incorporated new states, for example. The nations that Ben has cited, Poland and France, their borders have shifted and changed over time with various European wars. What makes those nations distinct and good in their own way, maybe less so France, but hey, I'm a Brit, we have old grudges, is the people that reside in them. People make nations. People generate the ideas that are ascribed to them. When you say American values, the reason you say they are distinctly American is because they come from Americans. They are most intuitive to Americans. This standard applies for Israel, because when the Jews were wandering the desert, or in Egypt, or in the 2,000 years between the fall of the Second Temple and 1948 when the state was re-established, they didn't cease to be a nation or a people. Just because you aren't in a landmass, or your ideas shift and change, does not mean that you are no longer a coherent people, a nation. And so, if you're encouraging people to move away from their families just because it isn't affordable anymore, whether it's internal migration or international migration, you dislocate people from that people. You turn them into diasporas, essentially in exile from their own families. And we know that all city-states, thanks to Coulanges and Larry Siedentop's books, all city-states in antiquity formed from tribes, which are collections of families which worship the same ancestors, which form religions. From their burial rites and rituals at the hearth come customs and traditions, which define the values and habits that are ascribed to that people, to that nation. So if you take people away from their families, you break up the nation. And I hate to be that guy, but I would notice that if someone had said to Ben Shapiro, well, if the Jews can't afford to live in Israel without the defense memorandum that the US pays them in the billions every year, as well as providing other support, then they should move to another country, that would be called anti-Semitic. Now, there is a dispute over the frontier spirit of the Jews in Israel at the moment because they're moving to new areas and building new settlements in places that their Arab neighbors haven't been so enterprising to do so before. This is why Trump recognizes sovereignty over the Golan Heights. So Ben might say that his people are being enterprising, are showing that frontier spirit, and that's why it's become a good country. But I happen to notice that Israel is not opening up its borders to diluting its labor force from the third world, whereas America is. Israel as a country exists to protect the ethnic Jewish people and their interests. So, America should have the same standard as Israel. It should protect the American people's interest, and it's not in the American people's interest to import lots of cheap foreign labor to demographically, culturally, and economically terraform cities and American states to price Americans out of the lands where their ancestors have been for hundreds of years, and then in response to that encourage them just move where it's cheaper. Basically, be chased across the map by a demographic tide that you have voted against that is pricing you out of your own home. And if claims to the indigeneity of the land apply to Jews in Israel, then it should also apply to heritage Americans who have not had a 2,000-year gap in inhabiting that land, but instead whose ancestors moved over as early as the Mayflower, have settled in states for hundreds of years, have built them up, and who have only recently either been pulled or pushed out of said states, cities, and towns because of economic factors driven by mass migration that they often vote against. That's the appeal of Vance's protectionist politics. A rootedness, a promise to have a regional identity, to raise your family around your family, to have your interests as an American people put first and not have to compete with the entire globe for economic opportunities and have your culture erased just because America is ideologically committed to free markets and colorblind meritocracy when the nations and peoples that it is importing are not, and therefore they will exploit those permissive policies to their own ethnic interests. And this is what generated the backlash on X to Ben's comments. Mike Cernovich here says, if we want Democrats to have a supermajority, then this is the message for the GOP to adopt. Tell people they need to move. Don't form family bonds. Worship the banks and big corporations. My goodness. This is why I responded, I wonder why the establishment conservative message of, quote, move away from your family to be a rootless rent-serf, working a soulless spreadsheet job, enriching corporate lobbyists who bribe politicians to import your cheaper replacements failed to resonate with Gen Z. In the replies to my post, Christian Hines, an account that you should be following, posted that it was an absolute gem. Well, he had one of his own. In his response to Ben Shapiro's clip, he referenced Christopher Lash's posthumous book, Revolt of the Elites, which I recommend that people read. And he says that Lash spoke about this phenomenon and he did not speak kindly about it. So what did Lash say about the effect of cities and their deleterious downward pressure on social trust, family formation, and their generation of the progressive values of a professional, managerial, and creative class? Well, he wrote things 3 decades ago that apply just as well today. Concerning the effect of capital on culture, Lash wrote, thanks to the decline of old money and the old money ethic of civic responsibility, local and regional loyalties are sadly attenuated today. The mobility of capital and the emergence of a global market contribute to the same effect. The new elites, which include not only corporate managers but all those professionals that produce and manipulate information, the lifeblood of the global market, are far more cosmopolitan or at least more restless and migratory than their predecessors. Advancement in business and the professions these days requires a willingness to follow the siren call of opportunity wherever it leads. Those who stay at home forfeit the chance of upward mobility. Success has never been so closely associated with mobility, a concept that figured only marginally in the 19th century definition of opportunity. Its ascendancy in the 20th century is itself an important indication of the erosion of the democratic ideal, which no longer envisions a rough equality of condition, but merely the selective promotion of non-elites into the professional managerial class. Ambitious people understand then that a migratory way of life is the price of getting ahead. It is a price they gladly pay since they associate the idea of a home with intrusive relatives and neighbors, small-minded gossip, and hidebound conventions. The new elites are in revolt against Middle America as they imagine it, a nation technologically backward, politically reactionary, repressive in its sexual morality, middle-brow in its tastes, smug and complacent, dull and dowdy. Those who covet membership in the new aristocracy of brains tend to congregate on the coasts, turning their back on the heartland and cultivating ties with the international market in fast-moving money, glamour, fashion, and popular culture. It is a question whether they think of themselves as Americans at all. Patriotism, certainly, does not rank very high in their hierarchy of values. Multiculturalism, on the other hand, suits them to perfection, conjuring up the agreeable image of a global bazaar in which exotic cuisines, exotic styles of dress, exotic music, exotic tribal customs can be savoured indiscriminately with no questions asked and no commitments required. The new elites are at home only in transit, en route to a high-level conference, to the grand opening of a new franchise, to an international film festival, or to an undiscovered resort. Theirs is essentially a tourist's view of the world, not a perspective likely to encourage a passionate devotion to democracy. Lash's criticism of capital and its downward pressure on the conditions that make democracy possible is that, for a voting populace to resolve logistical and economic issues, it requires their identity to be culturally coherent. They have to be a pre-political we, as Roger Scruton wrote. A cohesive unit who can collectively bargain for their interests. If you not only just dislocate intelligent people from their towns, draw them into a city which encourages them to create a new identity based on progressive values rather than one of family and shared religion and regional solidarity, then you not only deprive those towns of the ability to be replenished and be thriving and have all of their young people act as custodians to their culture, you create a constituency of anywheres who scrabble over dwindling economic opportunities, and so will just vote themselves more stuff. Hey presto, you get Zohran Mamdani. Add to that mix the ideology of multiculturalism, that if they're only there for a short time, they might as well experience all the things that they can get, and so they can sample all the cultures of the world being imported into their cities as if it's a global buffet, and the incentive for large corporations to import cheap labor from overseas, thereby to import those people also. Then you also get, in a democracy, ethnic client blocs voting to redistribute resources from the wealthy outgroup to their work-shy and impoverished in-group. Basically, you get Zohran Mamdani being third world Bane, saying, I'm going to take white people's stuff and give it to people who look like me instead. So, the idea that you can just move to places with more economic opportunities, then, creates the conditions that you bemoan that lead to the elections of Zohran Mamdani figures. It creates rootless Americans who hate their own culture. It manufactures consent for mass migration that then produces ethnic voting blocs that call to globalize the intifada and to take property from white people and give it as a form of reparations to immigrants. You might hate this politics, but your economic prescriptions are creating the conditions that give it demographic and cultural fodder. As Lash wrote here, democracy works best when men and women do things for themselves with the help of their friends and neighbours instead of depending on the state. Not that democracy should be equated with rugged individualism. Self-reliance does not mean self-sufficiency. Self-governing communities, not individuals, are the basic units of democratic society. It is the decline of those communities, those families in a set place who have been there for generations, Ben, more than anything else, that calls the future of democracy into question. Suburban shopping malls are no substitute for neighbourhoods. The same pattern of development has been repeated in one city after another. with the same discouraging results. The flight of population to the suburbs, followed by the flight of industry and jobs, has left our cities destitute. As the tax base shrivels, public services and civic amenities disappear. Attempts to revive the city by constructing convention centres and sports facilities designed to attract tourists merely heighten the contrast between wealth and poverty. The city becomes a bazaar, but the luxuries on display in its exclusive boutiques, hotels and restaurants are beyond the reach of most residents. Some of those residents turn to crime as the only access to the glittering world seductively advertised as the American dream. Those with more modest aspirations, meanwhile, are squeezed out by high rents, gentrification, and misguided policies intended to break up ethnic neighborhoods that allegedly stand in the way of racial integration. So there's a few points here. First of all, if all of the enterprising young people leave a city, you abandon it to the criminals, to the mercantile foreigners, to the resentful race hustlers like Zohran Mamdani. But also, why should people have to forfeit their ancestral lands, the places and the cultures that are most familiar to them, so that their cities can be turned into tourist attractions, museums, economic opportunity zones, massive job centres, global bus stations? They shouldn't. They should not have to accept this state of affairs. And you resign yourself to accepting this state of affairs by accepting that you have to move elsewhere to get ahead, rather than staying and fighting and collectively bargaining for political change. Why should Americans have to give up their cities just because resentful foreigners have been imported by large corporations and have demographically terraformed and culturally impoverished the place when they never wanted them to? Lash notes that cities retain a residual importance as the home of large law firms, advertising agencies, publishing companies, entertainment enterprises and museums, but the middle-class neighborhoods that sustained a vigorous civic culture are rapidly disappearing. Mere remnants, our cities are increasingly polarized. Upper-middle-class professionals, together with the service workers who cater to their needs, maintain a precarious hold on the high-rent districts and barricade themselves against the poverty and crime threatening to engulf them. This is Bertrand de Juvenel's higher, middle, lower tier power system. The higher and lower attack the middle. The higher are large corporations, hedge fund managers, and politicians who weaponize the resentful low-wage underclass against the middle class, who they squeeze as a diminishing tax base until that middle class flee in order to maintain their grip on power, because they foster dependency among the transitory, low-wage migrant working class. And all that's left are an increasingly endangered, progressive, indoctrinated, professional, managerial class who keep voting for the politicians that import these immigrants against the wishes of the heritage Americans who have already fled the cities for the suburbs. However, that's not a sustainable system because they are the more economically productive ones, and so you get a spillover from the cities when the cities become high crime, ungovernable, and lack economic opportunities. And so those dependent classes and the politicians that import them will follow the middle-class heritage Americans who just want to live in peace and earn a living and own a home out to the suburbs. Urban sprawl will continue to expand and render the quiet places where Ben advocates that you retreat equally as awful, equally as unaffordable, equally as unrecognizable. So just running away is not sustainable. It might be on an individual level if your city is high crime thanks to Soros-funded DAs, or if your entire neighborhood has been colonized by low-wage third world migration. That might be an option on the table for you and your family to keep them safe. But in aggregate, if every heritage American, or Londoner like me, were to do this to the cities that we were born and raised in, then we just give up our ancestral lands to international capital, the rootless anywheres who don't care about it, and the third world dependents who render it unsafe and unrecognizable. This passage, bear in mind, was written in the 90s by Lash, and he predicts how cities create the coalition of the resentful between the progressive professional managerial class and the ethnic tourists that are the low-wage labour that is imported into largely subsidised housing by politicians and large businesses in cities like New York. And again, the solution of just move is not sustainable here. Lash wrote, The upper middle class, the heart of the new professional and managerial elites, is defined, apart from its rapidly rising income, not so much by its ideology as by the way of life that distinguishes it more and more unmistakably from the rest of the population. Even its feminism, that is, its commitment to the two-career family, is a matter more of practical necessity than of political conviction. Efforts to define a new class composed of public administrators and policymakers, rather relentlessly pushing a program of liberal reforms, ignore the range of political opinions among the professional and managerial elites. These groups constitute a new class only in the sense that their livelihoods rest not so much on the ownership of property as on the manipulation of information and professional expertise. Their investment in education and information, as opposed to property, distinguishes them from the rich bourgeoisie, the ascendancy of which characterized an earlier stage of capitalism, and from the old proprietary class, the middle class in the strict sense of the term, that once made up the bulk of the population, since they embrace a wide variety of occupations: brokers, bankers, real estate promoters and developers, engineers, consultants of all kinds, systems analysts, scientists, doctors, publicists, publishers, editors, advertising executives, art directors, movie makers, entertainers, journalists, television producers and directors, artists, writers, university professors. The yuckies, as my friend Tate Brown calls them, rather than the yuppies, the young creative class. And since they lack a common political outlook, it is also inappropriate to characterize managerial and professional elites as a new ruling class. Alvin Gouldner, in one of the most convincing attempts to anatomize the new class, found the unifying element in their culture of critical discourse, but even though this formation captures an essential feature of the secular analytical attitude that now prevails in the higher circles, it exaggerates the intellectual component in the culture of the new elites and their interest in the rationalization of life, just as it minimizes their continuing fascination with the capitalist market and their new frenzied search for profits. So, progressivism, which Ben opposes, is as much a consequence of postmodernism, neo-Marxism, and liberal ideology as it is the brain drain effect on small towns that cities have when capital centralizes economic opportunities in urban environments and not just dislocates young professionals from their families, their religion, and their regional identity, and makes it impossible for them to afford to have children and raise them in a property of their own, but also then imports various peoples and their cultures to those cities, and doesn't encourage integration because of the number of people moving there, and because the only thing binding the people living in the city together is not shared culture, is not shared identity, but is a mercantile interest in making money for as long as the going gets good. And so the encouragement to just move to where is more affordable, where the job opportunities are more lucrative, encourages the flight of progressivism to and then from cities. So Ben's solution actually leads not just to fewer American families, fewer people owning homes, fewer people raising families around their families, but to the further spread of progressivism out from cities to the suburbs. Because, as we've seen with the flight of Californians to Texas, these people don't change their voting habits after they've destroyed their previous states. They, like locusts, devour the crop and move on to the next field. Lash notes, a more salient fact is that the market in which the new elites operate is now international in scope. Their fortunes are tied to enterprises that operate across national boundaries. They are more concerned with the smooth functioning of the system as a whole than with any of its parts, than with any community, identity, or local culture that you should be preserving rather than economic gains. Their loyalties, if the term is not itself anachronistic in this context, are international rather than regional, national, or local. They have more in common with their counterparts in Brussels or Hong Kong than with the masses of Americans not yet plugged into the network of global communications. And this is the current war at the heart of MAGA, as exemplified by the likes of J.D. Vance versus Ben's encouragement to move where the economics are better, where housing is more affordable. Are you a rootless anywhere who has more in common with a crypto bro in Dubai, or are you a middle American who is tired of being dispossessed from not just your economy, but from your regional identity, from your culture, being considered a second-class citizen in your own ancestral country, and do you want not just mass deportations of people who don't belong here, who are exploiting your economy and changing your culture, but do you want your birthright realized and opportunities that were once offshored moved back to America, where Americans are far more capable, thanks to their culture, of making use of them than cheap third world foreign labor, whether it is outsourced overseas or that third world foreign labor is imported to America to be doing jobs that Americans could well be doing themselves if they weren't made to compete with the third world and accept much cheaper wages that third worlders are willing to accept, because they then siphon off those economic gains via remittances back to the third world, treating America, Britain, Europe, and the like as the piggy bank for India, Africa, Pakistan, and the Middle East. And this dislocation effect, this coalition of rootless progressives and mercantile immigrants, is why New York voted for Mamdani. This piece in the New York Times just says it out loud. The prescription is, according to this author, that Mamdani built an insurgency within the Democratic Party primary electorate first by mobilizing traditionally quiescent young voters, many of whom have found that their bachelors do not guarantee a good job or any at all, and then drawing in non-white voters and more of the college-educated middle class. Democrats have been trying to win for 2 decades with what came to be known as an upstairs-downstairs coalition, a higher and lower against the middle power base, of largely white college-educated voters and non-white voters of all educational backgrounds. The Mamdani movement added 2 crucial ingredients: anger and moral purpose, and in doing so, actually expanded the electorate itself. You know what makes those young voters angry? The mentality that Ben Shapiro has, which is, yes, things are more affordable. Yes, large corporate firms have been lobbying to dilute your labor bargaining power, but if you don't like it, pull your bootstrap laces tighter and move elsewhere that you can afford it. Telling people that they are just not working hard enough when the game is rigged against them will lead people to recognize that Romney-style Republican capitalism is selling them a false bill of goods, and so they'll either go to the likes of protectionism promised by J.D. Vance and MAGA, or the gay race communism offered by Zohran Mamdani. The open socialism that is saying we will have state-run grocery stores, state-subsidized bus fares, and we'll pay for it all by taking from the property of white people. Ultimately, Ben Shapiro's promise of unfettered free market entrepreneurialism refutes itself and manufactures consent for Zohran Mamdani's politics. Ben Shapiro is inadvertently building the resentful coalition that elected Zohran Mamdani, and the Democrats know it. So this is why, when Mike Cernovich said, if Republicans want the Democrats to have a supermajority, keep saying the things that Ben Shapiro is saying, because this false promise created this coalition of well-educated but impoverished and indebted white progressives and low-wage resentful immigrant workers. Lash recognized this. He wrote, "Instead of serving as a counterweight to the market, the family was invaded and undermined by the market. Just move to meet market demands." The sentimental veneration of motherhood, even at the peak of its influence in the late 19th century, could never quite obscure the reality that unpaid labor bears the stigma of social inferiority when money becomes the universal measure of value. If you put the economy over your culture and families, you create a downward pressure on families. You manufacture consent for the feminist claim that housework is drudgery, housework is unpaid labor, and therefore women should seek economic independence from men, which then makes it less affordable to have a single income family and means that neither parent is present to raise their own children, which then means that birth rates are low, which is then used as an excuse by politicians to flood the labor market with cheap foreign labor to meet pension and Medicare payment commitments, because otherwise, if Americans aren't replacing themselves, then Americans must be replaced with people from the rest of the world. In the long run, women were forced into the workplace not only because their families needed extra income, but because paid labor seemed to represent their only hope of gaining equality with men. In our time, it is increasingly clear that children pay the price for this invasion of the family by the market. With both parents in the workplace and grandparents conspicuous by their absence, the family is no longer capable of sheltering children from the market. The television set becomes the principal babysitter by default. Its invasive presence deals the final blow to any lingering hope that the family can provide a sheltered space for children to grow up in. Children are now exposed to the outside world from the time they are old enough to be left unattended in front of the tube. They're exposed to it, moreover, in a brutal yet seductive form that reduces the values of the marketplace to their simplest terms. And this is even more pertinent with the invention of the smartphone and internet video streaming. The internet has become the babysitter for the few babies being born to heritage Americans. The family is being disrupted by downward pressure from the market, from the state and the big businesses. And yet again, Ben Shapiro's suggestion that just move when the market is pricing you out of your homes, make it impossible to own a property and have a family in it, is not a seductive offer to young Americans who recognize that the game is rigged against them. And this, in turn, manufactures consent for the growth of the state. In the absence of these concentric circles, this hierarchy of ordo amoris, of family, community, congregation, country, that insulates the individual from state power, you just have the individual naked and afraid before the state. It's like removing all of the interceding Russian nesting dolls between the smallest and the largest, and then dropping the nesting doll on the ground. The one inside will rattle around and get damaged in the bigger one. The individual will be at the whim of the state. And so, if small government fiscally responsible conservatives, like Ben Shapiro, want to shrink the size of the state, you actually need to have the family be an integral unit so that it shields the individual from relying on the state for not only economic opportunities, but their identity. And the way you don't do that is encouraging young people to move away from their birthplaces, where they want to birth and raise their own children. And the way that you do that is by making the housing more affordable and the job opportunities more plentiful in their towns and cities. And the way that you do that is by decreasing migration and making it so they don't have to compete with the entire world for housing and job opportunities. Something Ben didn't mention in his trigonometry clip. And Lash observed this contradiction in the politicians of his time. He said, as formal organizations break down, people will have to improvise ways of meeting their immediate needs, patrolling their own neighborhoods, withdrawing their children from public schools in order to educate them at home. Are we not already seeing this? The default of the state will thus contribute in its own right to the restoration of informal mechanisms of self-help. But it is hard to see how the foundations of civic life can be restored unless this work becomes an overriding goal of public policy. It's not just enough to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, form communities in a frontier spirit outside the purview of the state because the state won't let you. Instead, you do need to collectively bargain for your interests as a pre-political we, as an American people, not just an idea. Lash wrote, "We have heard a good deal of talk about the repair of our material infrastructure, but our cultural infrastructure needs attention too, and more than just the rhetorical attention of politicians who praise family values while pursuing economic policies that undermine them." That sentence applies to Ben Shapiro and all of the free marketeer Romney-style Republicans that have done nothing to preserve the American heritage and culture upon which the economy rests, and have instead pursued expedient economic gains out of an ideological commitment to free markets. So, what's the more enticing offer? Ironically, it's presented by the likes of Nikki Haley's son. Nayland Haley has recently made headlines for criticizing the likes of Vivek Ramaswamy, who positions himself as in continuity with the Founding Fathers, but denies the distinct ethnic and religious cultural identity of America, and boils it down instead to a culture of striving, being Steve Urkel rather than the jocks in Saved by the Bell, and vague values like meritocracy and colorblindness, as if Martin Luther King himself was one of the Founding Fathers. And by the way, Martin Luther King was a party to rape, a plagiarist, who denied the incarnation of Christ in his doctoral thesis, and wanted reparations and state subsidies for black people. So, one speech does not make him a paragon of colorblind meritocracy, and does not retroactively rewrite the Constitution to be values that can apply to anyone from anywhere in any time and place. Nayland Haley recognizes this, but he ties immigration to the tangible concerns, property, work, identity, that Zoomers have that Ben Shapiro's answer to their concerns neglected to mention. Nayland told Sohrab Ahmari, We don't just stop illegal immigration. I think we need to stop legal immigration. When Sohrab mentioned that Nalin had called on Twitter for Mehdi Hassan, the Indian Muslim who masquerades as first a Brit, now an American, to be denaturalized, Nalin added, and deported. And he said, no, I quite literally mean that. I'm often sarcastic, but not in this case. I mean, he hates America. If you hate America, you shouldn't be in America. Everyone wants to make it so complicated. That's the thing with the past generation. They always talk about the rules, regulations, process. No, it's simple. If you don't like America, get out. Patriot. Because he recognizes that America rests on a certain set of coherent cultural givens, and America as a country and its economy cannot survive if you allow people who hate it, who don't play by its rules, who do not venerate it, who do not defer to the heritage and identity of Americans, to exploit its largesse for their own gains. That's not how American naturalization works legally, and the E-Right's calls to denaturalize and deport any immigrant who says the wrong thing clashes sharply with both constitutional writ and the spirit of the American tradition, Sohrab says. Not true. Thomas Jefferson would not have recognized Mehdi Hassan as an American. Just because he owned a Quran does not mean that he was a liberal pluralist. He declared war on the Barbary pirates for a reason. He says, and if that sort of thing were all that Nayland Haley stood for, he could easily be dismissed as just another online loudmouth, albeit one who puts his name and his face to his fulminations. Yet behind his bravado is a serious-minded 24-year-old recent graduate emerging from the political shadow cast by his mother. Nikki Haley supported legal, merit-based immigration as part of a pro-business platform, the Old Republican Party. Her son wants to close the border entirely. Nikki Haley believes it is not that Israel needs America, America needs Israel. Her son thinks Israel is just another country, and if they want to have a better relationship with the United States, they need to stop interfering in our politics. I'd vote for this man for president. Nikki Haley believes in an expansive foreign policy. Her son wants to end all foreign aid as long as we have unemployment, people below the poverty line, medical debt, and bad schools. America first. And the same mentality should be applied in my country as well. These domestic ills aren't abstractions to him. Quote, my friend group from high school all graduated, great degrees from great schools, he says. It's been a year and a half and not one of them has a job, not one. So I'm angry at that because I'm having to try and help my friends get jobs when their parents got jobs immediately, not just after graduating college, but out of high school. Statistics bear this out. In September, the share of long-term unemployed, those who've been out of the job market for more than 6 months, hit 26% according to the New York Times, much of it driven by recent graduates. It's up to 5% in the UK now. That's the highest since the COVID lockdowns. The jobs are available for recent grads are often precarious or temporary. Quote, so when you see a bunch of foreigners coming over here to take jobs that my friends wanted, Haley says, they have every right to be pissed and I'm pissed for them. It isn't just about jobs. I look at the housing market, he says, and I don't see how I'm ever going to own a house. And I do very well for someone my age. And I still don't see it. Again, the generational discontent. Quote, my parents bought their first house for $90,000. I mean, that house probably is now worth $400,000. How can we compete? The same thing happened to me. My wife and I got our first home at 4 times the price what my parents paid for it. They also got a much better deal because their deposit was a lot lower than ours, and in the late 90s, house prices ran about 3 times the average salary, whereas now it's 11 times the average salary. So most people cannot afford a home of their own, and so you're going to get fewer families, so you're not going to get the transmission of culture down the generational chain, so you're going to incentivize rootless, transitory economic agents who find solidarity in progressive identities either online or in cities, and you're then going to get more Zohran Mamdanis rather than small government, fiscally responsible cultural conservatives. So the promise to just move actively undermines the politics that the likes of Romney Republicans, Nikki Haley, and Ben Shapiro say they want. This unresolved contradiction is causing the polarization among my generation either to nationalist economic protectionists who want mass deportations or gay race communists who want to accelerate the revolution by stealing the wealthy and white people's stuff and giving it to themselves. One will work, one won't. But you're getting them both in tandem because the legacy free marketeer right has no answers for this, and they refuse to admit that their politics has led to this unsustainable state of affairs where my generation can't own homes and have families. As Nayland points out, I'm tired of having to go to CVS to push a button for an employee to come and unlock the toothpaste for me. That's ridiculous. He says, we are the United States of America, we don't do this. Things should be safe, things should work, people should have jobs, houses should be affordable. If the son of Nikki Haley feels this way, it's not hard to imagine the depths of anger and despair among less privileged Zoomers. Hello, a reality that probably explains, at least in part, the cohort's often brutal political rhetoric. It doesn't have to be this way. It's all a choice. We can recognize that a different choice can be made. And so, we can either stay and fight and refuse to be replaced economically, culturally, demographically in our own countries, refuse to consign ourselves to just being chased away from our ancestral lands, pursuing diminishing economic opportunities, so that we can pay increasing levels of tax to subsidize the stay of resentful third worlders in our country. We recognize that we can just choose something different and that we don't just have to move to where's more affordable and continue this vicious cycle of having a demographic revolving door and having our own homes be rendered impoverished and unrecognizable and places that we don't want to raise the kids that currently lots of us can't afford to have. That's why Ben Shapiro caught so much flack when he said just move, because his politics leads to the rise of leftist progressivism and replacement migration, and the politics that he has opposed from the likes of Tucker Carlson in 2018 or J.D. Vance as VP are the only way out of this. And that is what the Zoomers are starting to recognize.